favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you. I don't have anything else right now that I want to bring up. Anybody here that's got anything they want to bring up?
Yeah, I've got some questions which I gave you today, Tom. I
Yep.
hope you had a chance to take a look at. I don't know if I have some additional copies for the rest of you.
Well, I did copy that.
Okay, so they have
Everybody has
copies.
a copy, which I gave them.
Yeah, and what it is, it's a continuation of a conversation we had last Friday where I was just asking questions about where we stood with the adopting the wind law. And I was out of town here for 5 weeks, leaving right after you guys had finished your committee work and stuff. And I will say right up front, I thought the committee did a pretty darn good job. I mean, there's some things there I might not agree with, but I know you're gonna have a public hearing, you're gonna have more input, but you really did do a good job. And I think when you got done, you had something that I was hopeful that you'd go to a public hearing. In fact, I was wondering whether the public hearing would be going on while I was gone off to California for 5 weeks, but it wasn't. And a number of things have happened since then as well. I mean, you had courtroom and some other things. And so a series of questions and to begin with, and I think that there are probably questions that I have, but I'm sure a lot of other people do as well, just to sort of find out where we stand and what the status is. And the one thing that I'm really concerned about is the fact, is the town even intending to adopt it?
Well, I guess after I've had time to look through all the questions and do some consultation and a lot of thought about it, I guess right tonight, I'm not prepared to answer that.
So that takes care of question number 2. It says, if so, when do you anticipate it to be adopted? Which, and now the next question would be then, because of what is occurring here with particularly St. Lawrence Wind Farm in the draft EIS and all the application process. Third question is, would the town ensure us that no wind project application would be approved before passage of the new wind law? So in other words, what I'm concerned about is if we go ahead and they're moving ahead with our whole process, you got the public hearings, you go to a final draft environmental impact statement. I think there was something in the paper or somewhere along the line where they were anticipating to begin construction sometime in the spring of 2010, of 2010. The question would be, at some point, you're gonna be approving an application, and, if you've got no idea whether you're gonna do a wind law, so the question is, are you prepared, is this board gonna be approving an application, or are you gonna wait until you have the wind law in place before you approve an application?
I don't think there's any of these questions that at the moment I could answer.
Well, why don't we go down with
Too many things up in the air.
Well then, in other words, you're not prepared to say anything about, there's a question here, if you terminate the current wind law process by inaction, which is basically what is happening here. In other words, you don't know what you're doing, but you're really not doing anything, so.
Well, it's still being reviewed by our attorney. It's still in that process.
Well then, why don't we go back here with a question about approving the passage of a new wind law. When I asked you that question Friday, the answer was that you would probably approve the application before you adopted a wind law. So you're suggesting that has changed after consultation?
I don't think that's necessarily true.
Okay. Question number 6. From our consultation Friday, if one of the reasons for stopping the adoption of a new wind law is the board's dislike of recent newspaper ads that were submitted by the WEPEG group, then why would you derail a process whose purpose is to protect many non-participating residents who happen to live near some of these projected wind turbines? In other words, the adopted law and the whole purpose of the zoning law is to provide and afford protection of people that are going to be nearby to where some of these things are going to be developed. So that's important for them to have something. And I took a look at the map from latest St. Lawrence Wind Draft Environmental, the supplemental environmental impact statement. I found there were 60 non-participating residents just within the bounds of the project, and this did not include any of the folks along the river. So there are a number there, and I haven't even counted, the number of non-participants in the BP area, so there are a number of folks there. And these folks deserve some sort of protection. I mean, if you're gonna move ahead with the project statement, with the application process, we've got a public hearing coming up with the supplemental draft environmental impact statement and other things. We are moving ahead, the town isn't moving ahead, so the question is, are you gonna approve that application? Should be a simple question. Sounds like yes to me, that's what it was last Friday, was yes.
Well, we're not stopping the process, I guess I can answer that much.
So you're not gonna stop the process?
We're moving forward with
Right.
what's going on.
Question 7. Recently, the courts ruled that the town has the right to designate wind farms as utilities under the current zoning law, right? I think that was what it said. But did the courts rule that the best way to protect non-participating residents with turbines nearby is without a supplemental wind law? In other words, they say you had the right to call these things utilities in that. But is that the best way? Did the court say anything about the best way to protect non-participating residents?
Not that I'm aware of.
So they
There's
did.
that court decision that said that.
So in other words, it's similar to, say, the court decisions where if you got parents that say they don't wanna have their kids to have vaccinations, the courts have ruled in many of those instances that, yeah, a parent has the right to do that, but it really isn't necessarily the best way to approach it. You really aren't, some of those parents are not acting in the best interest of their children. The courts still realize you have the rights to do that. This is kind of a similar situation, isn't it? Question 8. For the non-participating residents, are their rights best protected by a fair wind law, or are they best protected by relying solely on the judgment of a planning board whose composition includes 3 members with ties to the wind developers? Now you think about that. If the zoning law is there to protect the interest and the rights of, the neighbors of folks that are gonna have these wind leases and that, are their interests and rights gonna be best protected with a wind law, in which the whole committee sat down and tried to provide some sort of guidance for that? Or is it gonna be best left to the judgment of the planning board, without any guidelines, without anything, and just relying on their judgment, of which 3 of them have financial ties, or indirect or direct financial ties to these developers?
I don't think you can make that statement. 3 people that have financial ties?
Oh, that part, now, okay, so however you want to describe that, 2 have financial ties or indirectly as pointed out. So the question is, are those people better off with a law, or are they better off with no laws, no rules, and just relying on a judgment of 5 people sitting around the table? You don't want to answer that question. Okay.
Well, I'd like to respond to it, you got there 3 members with ties to wind developers, they were on the board long before this, or some of them were on the board long before this issue come up. They just couldn't.
Oh, I understand.
I mean, you can go around this room and you can pick people that are opposed to them, you can pick people that are, in favor of them. It's just the random draw, and it just so happens that by digging deep enough, you can find some ties with those 3 members.
Okay, so
But
let's,
don't give the indication that those 3 members are gonna financially gain from those windmills. That's wrong.
So remove that part of the question,
Okay.
and we get back to the issue of, are those people, non-participating residents, better off with a wind law, or just no rules, no laws, and just the judgment of 5 people sitting around the table?
It might be better for the 5 people sitting around the table.
It
Might be better for you. How do you know it ain't? You don't.
Well, I know
Because
it
of the
ain't,
law.
I know it ain't
You don't
from question number 9, which says, in the 2 draft laws that were done here, one in 2006 and the other in 2009, there's a purpose statement at the beginning of each of those laws. And the purpose statement